My father's hand closed around my hair, and my head hit the wooden floor of that reception hall hard enough that the room actually seemed to ring for a moment. 200 wedding guests frozen mid-motion, champagne glasses suspended in the air, the string quartet's bow stopping mid-note. I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. I lay there for one long second, tasting blood where my teeth had caught my lip, staring up at chandelier light scattered across white ceiling tiles, and I whispered 6 words that nobody in that room expected to hear from me. Call the number in my phone. Minutes earlier, everything had felt like it was going exactly according to plan. The plan I'd spent months preparing without anyone in my family suspecting a thing. My father, Harold Winslow, had pulled me aside in the small private room adjacent to the ballroom, minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, holding out the title to my SUV, a vehicle I'd purchased entirely with my own money 3 years earlier. "Transfer it to your brother right now," he'd said. Holding out a pen like this was a simple administrative matter rather than an absurd demand minutes before my wedding. "No," I'd said, quietly but firmly, watching his face shift from irritation to something far more dangerous. "Nobody defies me," he'd roared, and then his hand was in my hair, and the floor was rushing up to meet me, and 200 guests were about to witness exactly who my father really was. What none of them knew, watching me whisper those 6 words into the stunned silence, was that I'd been documenting my father's behavior for months, preparing for exactly this kind of moment, though I genuinely hoped I'd never actually need to use it. My name is Vanessa Winslow, and I was 29 years old on what should have been the happiest day of my life, marrying a man named Theo who'd spent 2 years patiently teaching me what healthy love actually looked like, a stark contrast to everything I'd grown up believing was normal in my father's house. Harold Winslow had built a successful construction company over 30 years, and along with that success came a controlling, volatile temperament that everyone in our family had learned to navigate carefully, walking on eggshells around his moods, his demands, his absolute conviction that he alone decided how every member of his family should live their lives. My older brother Derek had always been my father's favorite, praised and indulged in ways I'd never experienced, while I'd grown up understanding that my role in the family was to be quietly compliant, grateful for whatever attention I received, never questioning decisions made on my behalf. The SUV, purchased with money I'd saved from 6 years of working as a nurse, had become an unexpected flashpoint 2 months before my wedding, when Derek's own vehicle broke down and my father decided, without consulting me, that I should simply hand mine over. I'd refused then too, quietly, hoping the matter would fade the way most disagreements with my father eventually did once his attention moved elsewhere. It hadn't faded. Instead, my father had apparently decided that my wedding day, surrounded by family and friends, offered the perfect pressure point to finally force my compliance, believing correctly that I'd want to avoid a scene on such an important day. What he hadn't accounted for was that I'd stopped being the quietly compliant daughter months earlier, ever since a conversation with Theo that had finally helped me recognize patterns in my father's behavior that I'd spent my entire life normalizing. That conversation with Theo had happened 4 months before the wedding, during a quiet evening when I'd mentioned, almost casually, an incident from my childhood that I'd never fully processed. My father had thrown a plate against the wall when I was 12, simply because I'd questioned his decision to cancel a school trip he'd previously promised to fund. I'd laughed slightly while telling the story, the way you do when something's been normalized so thoroughly it doesn't register as alarming anymore. Theo hadn't laughed. He'd gone quiet, then asked careful, gentle questions that slowly unraveled years of incidents I'd buried under the label of Dad's temper. Moments of intimidation and control I'd learned to minimize because acknowledging them fully felt too destabilizing. That conversation had led me, cautiously, to a therapist named Dr. Reyes, who'd helped me understand, over several months, that my father's behavior followed recognizable patterns of coercive control, patterns that typically escalated rather than resolved on their own. Sometimes, Dr. Reyes had told me during one session, documenting behavior isn't about pursuing legal action immediately. It's about protecting yourself with evidence, in case a situation ever escalates beyond what you can manage safely on your own. I'd started keeping a private journal after that, detailed entries about specific incidents, dates, witnesses when available. I'd also started recording certain conversations with my father, particularly ones involving demands or threats, using a simple voice memo app on my phone, something Dr. Reyes had suggested as a practical safety measure rather than something I ever expected to actually need. I hadn't told anyone in my family about this documentation, not even Theo initially, uncertain whether I was being appropriately cautious or unnecessarily paranoid about a man who was, after all, still my father. Standing in that private room before my wedding, watching my father's face turn red over a simple refusal about my own vehicle, I understood immediately that whatever caution I'd exercised in the past was about to become critically important. The number I'd asked the guests to call belonged to my cousin Patricia, a family law attorney who'd also, unbeknownst to my father, become someone I'd confided in extensively over the past 4 months as I quietly documented his behavior. Patricia had made it clear that if anything serious ever happened, if my father's escalating control ever crossed into actual violence, I should call her immediately, before calling anyone else. My best friend Sandra, standing frozen near the ballroom entrance, snapped out of her shock first, fumbling for her phone, quickly locating Patricia's number in my contacts exactly as I'd instructed. What happened next unfolded with a strange, surreal speed. Patricia, already aware of the general situation through months of careful updates, had apparently anticipated something like this might eventually happen. She'd prepared, quietly, documentation of her own, gathering witness statements from family members who'd previously confided in her about incidents with my father over the years, incidents I hadn't even known other relatives had experienced. Within 20 minutes, as I sat in a chair someone had brought me, an ice pack pressed against the back of my head, 2 police officers arrived, called by multiple wedding guests who'd witnessed the assault firsthand. My father, still red-faced and seemingly unable to understand why everyone was reacting so dramatically to what he apparently considered a justified response to my defiance, found himself being formally questioned in front of the same 200 guests who'd witnessed him attack me. "She wouldn't listen," he kept repeating, as if that explained everything, as if 30 years of being unquestioningly obeyed had convinced him that any resistance justified whatever response he deemed necessary. I watched something shift in my mother's expression as she stood beside him, years of quiet complicity finally cracking under the weight of witnessing, undeniably, in front of everyone we knew, exactly what my father was capable of. The wedding didn't continue that day, obviously, though Theo never once suggested I should worry about that. He'd rushed to my side the moment chaos broke out, cancelling the ceremony without hesitation. His only concern being whether I needed to go to the hospital, which I ultimately did, for observation and documentation of the injury. My father was arrested that evening, charged with assault, the incident witnessed by too many people, recorded on too many phones, for any version of denial or minimization to hold up under scrutiny. Patricia, working alongside my emergency room documentation and the voice memos I'd collected over the previous months, helped build a case that extended beyond just that single incident of violence. The months of documentation I'd gathered, initially intended simply as a protective measure, became crucial evidence establishing a clear pattern of controlling, threatening behavior that had apparently affected more family members than just me. Derek, my brother, the sibling who'd always been favored, came forward during the investigation with his own uncomfortable admissions about years of manipulation and financial control our father had exercised over his life as well, despite the favoritism I'd always assumed protected him from similar treatment. My mother, after weeks of what I can only describe as slow, painful realization, finally left my father as well, unable to continue rationalizing decades of behavior she'd witnessed clearly, undeniably, in front of 200 witnesses at my wedding. Theo and I married quietly 3 months later, a small ceremony with close friends and family, deliberately different from the large, elaborate wedding my father had insisted on funding and controlling every detail of originally. This time, the day belonged entirely to us, unburdened by anyone else's demands or expectations. I kept the SUV, obviously, though I sold it eventually, unable to look at it without remembering exactly what it had represented that day, replacing it with something that felt entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. My father's case eventually resulted in a plea agreement, probation and mandatory anger management courses rather than significant jail time. An outcome that initially frustrated me until Patricia explained that the documented pattern of behavior, now part of the official record, would matter far more for our family's long-term safety than the specific sentence handed down that day. I don't speak to my father anymore. Not out of dramatic estrangement, but out of simple, necessary distance, the kind that comes from finally understanding that some relationships require boundaries too significant to maintain the way society expects families to maintain connection regardless of circumstances. My mother and I have slowly rebuilt something honest between us, built now on her willingness to finally acknowledge the pattern she'd spent decades minimizing, rather than the surface-level normalcy we'd maintained for years before that wedding day forced everything into unavoidable clarity. Derek and I are closer now too, in an unexpected way, both of us processing different versions of the same controlling household we'd grown up navigating, understanding finally that his favoritism had never actually protected him the way I'd always assumed it had. I think about that moment often, my head against the wooden floor, 200 faces frozen in shock, 6 quiet words that changed the entire trajectory of my life within seconds. I don't regret documenting those months beforehand, the careful, quiet preparation that felt paranoid at the time but ultimately protected not just me, but my entire family, from continuing to absorb behavior that had been normalized for far too long. Theo and I are building the kind of life together that I never fully understood was possible growing up, one built on mutual respect rather than fear, on genuine partnership rather than control. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself since that day. If you'd spent your entire life quietly preparing for a moment you hoped would never come, would you have had the strength to use that preparation when it finally mattered? Or would the shock of the moment have simply overwhelmed everything you'd carefully planned?